All right, we are live. Thanks everybody for joining me. Today I'm going to go over DocumentJS. It's kind of its alpha release. There's still a lot of work to be done for it, but this should give you an idea of what it's, how to use it and what its purpose is. So for this talk I'll cover, what its purpose is, what we're trying to accomplish with it, a quick overview of how to use it, and then an in-depth overview of how to kind of configure its behavior, how to actually use it to document your code, how to generate that documentation, customize the look of the documentation, and then actually a little bit about the code structure so that if you guys want to contribute changes, you'll have at least a little bit of insight on how to do it. And please, you guys from Bitovi who are in this room, stop me at any point if things are confusing, because I'm sure they will be for other people. So, what is DocumentJS? The goal for DocumentJS is to be for client and server-side JavaScript developers who want to document their code. It's a documentation engine, and unlike similar tools, I think its key attributes is that it produces multi-versioned documentation, which is really nice if you have a long-lived project where APIs change. It also can provide well-structured documentation, and you'll see by its support of Google closure annotations, it can be very, like using a very terse syntax, be very precise about what a method, what its arguments are, whether they're optional, what the type of each argument is, that kind of stuff can be very explicitly documented, which I think is a really nice feature for DocumentJS. And then while in the course of producing this presentation, I also think its customization is pretty impressive, what you can do with this customization. So let's talk about how you would use it to get just a very basic thing working. So to install, configure, document, and generate the documentation. So to install DocumentJS, just use npm install and make sure you save this in your package JSON. What this will do is it'll install the command line tool. What Node does, or npm does, is any commands, it'll stick in nodemodules.bin and DocumentJS. It'll create this DocumentJS executable. So you can, typically when we start actually generating things, you'll just be calling out to this executable. The next thing you need to do is configure. You need to create a DocumentJS.json file and configure this to essentially tell DocumentJS where the files are that you want to document and configure the output. And the primary thing you configure is a bunch of different sites. You can think of a site as kind of a self-contained piece of like a code, not a single individual code, but a code base. For something like CanJS, guides is separate from the API docs, so those would be two different sites. For this case, I'm just going to have a single site that I want to produce, which I'm going to call docs. And I can configure what files I want to find, like to process, with this glob option. And I give it a pattern for the glob, which is, this is kind of like a glob pattern that says basically all files relative, and everything is always going to be relative to this DocumentJS.json. All files within the kind of folder, the parent folder of DocumentJS.json that end with .markdown.md or end with .js. And let me turn on the comment. Sorry, let me turn on Q&A just in case there's any.
Is node modules not ignored by default?
Say that again?
So is node modules not ignored by default?
It is ignored by default.
Oh, it is.
So this is the default values that are used. So you don't actually have to write, if this is what you want, you don't actually have to fill out this option. This is just just showing with the defaults, kind of the standard stuff people might want to fill out. And then the ignore Bower components and node modules are ignored. Everything inside of there is ignored.
Gotcha.
So this configures kind of where you, the files that you want to process into documentation, and this configures where you want to export that documentation. So this will create a docs folder inside the kind of parent folder of DocumentJS, and it'll create an index.html page that kind of contains your, like, the parent object. And we'll talk about what the parent object is, but it will contain a docs/index.html that contains the documentation generated from this, the content found here. Now the default destination is actually going to be a sibling folder, so it's actually going to be, the default destination would be /docs if I didn't provide one. You know, I chose that because I didn't want to if someone had a docs folder, I didn't want to like blow it away or merge a bunch of generated HTML into it. So by the default behavior is to, in a sibling of the parent folder of DocumentJS, is to put something that matches your site name. Like create a folder that matches your site name and put it there. But with this configured, I might create a page that's going to house, like kind of be the home page for my project. That's going to be the index page. I'm going to call it, and I'll typically put that in readme.markdown, and the same readme file that that most applications have in a GitHub project. I'll use, so that it shows up nicely on the GitHub page, a HTML comment, but I'll say, hey, this is page my project, and everything will be have its parent be my project, because there's a kind of parent-child relationship with documentation. And then I just have whatever markdown I want for my home page, which is typically going to be, I think is best to use in like how to install and build and document a project. So I would just list that out. And then I might have everything linked to that. Sorry, for every other module in my application, I might do inline documentation, and then just make sure that its parent is my project if I want it to show up directly under the My Project page as a child of that. So here I'm documenting a module that exports a function. I'm giving it a name, which is actually the module name, components tab / kind of where I'm naming them in the way that, you know, we'll name them probably with ES6 or import them with ES6. And I just realized this should be in components /tab/tabs.js, but here I'm documenting the module tabs. I can give it what I want it to appear like, the title of the component, which I'm just going to write as a tabs HTML element, and just finish documenting it. And I'll generate the site by calling that DocumentJS. I can add watch to it, so it'll watch all of the files that are being processed and update itself when any of them change. And if I do that, I'll get something like this. I'll get my project, and my tabs component will show up underneath it. You can see here, if I didn't provide that title as tabs, it would have showed up as component, or it would have showed up as component /tabs/. But I think it's nicer if you show it as a instead of just a module, give it the actual element as what shows up here, and it'll build this. Any questions so far? You're muted. I can't hear you if you're speaking, David. If there's any other questions, or David, you could write in the questions.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Can you go back 2 slides?
Sorry, which slide?
2. Another one. There is a GitHub introduced that with Jekyll kind of quasi standard for Markdown projects to add like metadata. It's that YAML front matter. So instead of having this like commented section, it should be easy to read. It would be actually nice to add because that's what almost every static site generator is using right now to add metadata. So instead of having this comment, you would just do a / and then add some page : my project kind of thing. Would maybe nice to add to be compatible with static site generators.
I would imagine that most static site generators, this will also work, because this is just putting this creates a HTML comment.
Yeah, but if you look at it in GitHub, for example, like edit the actual thing, it gets like formatted nicely and things like that. So
I think this does too. But okay, yeah, I mean something to add, but I'll be honest, I'm not at a heart. There's a lot of other things that I would add before that. But absolutely, nice to have. So,
can you show the file structure, like the actual files that produce the HTML page? Can you show what that looks like? Does it create like a folder with index.html in it, or that kind of thing?
Yeah, it creates a folder, and because this will be detected as the parent. As long as something is overwhelmingly the parent of pretty much everything else, it will create this as the index.html, and it'll create a components tabs HTML page.
Where did you set the main parent? Do you do that in the DocumentJS.json?
You don't have to anymore. Now it will, like I said, it will detect if my project is the parent of pretty much everything else, and will assume that that is the index.html page.
Okay.
So yeah, this generates this my project page, and it's going to generate a tabs that looks like this. Tabs page that looks like this. But it's actually going to be called components. It's actually going to be called components like vertical bar tabs vertical bar .html, because these get converted. We don't create folders. All right. So now let's break down each one of those parts. Configuration, documentation, generation, and customizing. Let's break each one of those things down and go into depth what you can do. So the DocumentJS.json is defined by a .config object, which is documented on DocumentJS.com. And it looks like it has a bunch of different things in it, and I'll kind of break down what these look like. But to give an example, you have versions, which are going to define a version name to how to retrieve that version. So it'll actually go and download these and then generate their documentation recursively. There's a version dest, which describes where the version should be downloaded. So what this is going to do is say, hey, if we download 1.1, put it in relative to this .config 1.1, and then whatever the project is, which is CanJS. So we'll put it in 1.1 and 1.1/CanJS. There's also a default version and a default dest. This is so like CanJS.com. If I always want to link to, I don't want to link to CanJS.com/2.1/can-compute. Instead, I want to link to like CanJS.com/docs/can-compute. So that always links that are, if anybody ever puts up a link that's going to you want a central place to link to can-compute, that's not going to really go away or be, that's always going to be fresh and up to date. So that's why there's a default destination and a default version. The default version is kind of your active version you want documented. That's kind of in this central place, and this is where to put that default version. So it'll download master CanJS into just /CanJS. And this is so those paths are always the same, and if we go to 3.0, well, I can update the default version to 3.0, but all links should still kind of work that we're pointing to this kind of central location. Hopefully that makes sense. And then we already talked about sites. So you can have versions which it'll download these and generate their documentation, but then you can also have pages or documentation generated for kind of the current repository, which happens in sites. This is so like for canjs.com, we can generate the home page and other pages that really don't change with the version. They're kind of permanent pages. So like the contributing page, about page, that kind of stuff, home page is all generated with sites. And then you can also provide default values, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. These are default values that would site defaults. So you don't have to, if you have the same template theme for every single site and every single version you want it for, you can just define it once here and it gets applied to every other site config. So what a .config looks like, kind of from an API perspective, is you have, again, you have your versions, and they have a version name and a URL source or a project config. And then you have a version destination, default destination that are templates, and a version name as their default version. And you have the sites object that has a site name and a site config. And then you have a site defaults that also points to a site config. And we're going to break down, we're kind of recursively going to break down this .js object into other objects. So a project config, which was kind of these objects inside here for a specific version, looks like this. You can provide a source, which is the same kind of thing that was used here, a URL to download from. You can also provide the sites. Let's say, so CanJS 1.1 doesn't actually have a .config, or sorry, a DocumentJS.json in it. I can provide its sites for it.
Wait a second. What is a project config used for?
A project config is on a version. It's used for telling how to download a project, and also and if the project doesn't have a DocumentJS.json, it can be used to define how that project should be documented.
I see.
So this is saying once you download CanJS 1.1 Legacy, you're going to kind of create a docs. Essentially, you're going to use the default glob to find all the files in this, the JavaScript files and Markdown files, and you're going to produce a docs folder whose parent, the index page should be the CanJS object it finds in here, like the CanJS documented object it finds in here. You can also provide a path. So if you don't want to use the kind of versions destination or default dest, you can hard code a path where this should download. And you can also, if you put npm install to true, it'll use npm to install whatever the source is, instead of just downloading essentially the zip file here. I'm not sure when you might want to do a full npm install. I'm also, part of the reason I'm thinking about adding this is for Bower, so you can do Bower install, because like CanJS, its demos might not work unless you do a Bower install. So that's why I'm probably going to plan on adding a Bower install. So it'll download this and then it'll run Bower install on wherever it is. So that's a version, or that's a project config. That's what is available there. And like I said, a project config, that's an example, but it really just looks like a source with the URL, some sites that can get applied, and a site config, a path to where to download, and an npm install. Whether true or false. By default, it's false. So a site config, a site config, that's really where a lot of the action is. That's kind of this object in here, so there's a site, there's sites, and each site will have a name, but a site config is what's in orange. And it can have a destination where you want to generate the output, a glob, which can be a pattern to match for what files you want to match. A parent indicates what should be the home page. This can kind of be inferred now, but if you like said, hey, this doc object I named index, I want to be my home page, you could do that. Page config, this is any additional JavaScript data you want to pass to the actual page, HTML pages, so that JavaScript for the HTML pages could access it. This is the type of generators. We'll talk about this. How, given the doc objects this creates, which is like the data that it creates, how do we want to export that? And the default value is HTML. This is the default, generated output. But potentially you could put other module names in here that would get essentially the raw data and could export it however it wanted. The HTML generator allows you to override static and template values. So there you can pass overrides, and you can also tell the default HTML generator you could put false for it not to minify the build, so if you wanted to do debugging on its JavaScript, or to always rebuild every time the static JavaScript.
What does that mean exactly? What's the difference between force building and non-force building?
Once it takes a little bit to generate all the JavaScript and minify it. Force build will do that, minification every single time.
Mm-hmm.
But force build false, which is the default, will just, once it's built it won't try to build it again. It'll just use a cached version. So it's much faster.
You mean just the JavaScript, or what will it not build?
It would not build the JavaScript and the templates.
Okay.
Right? So it's because once the static content has been built, if I just changed some of the documentation around, I don't need to rebuild the static content every time.
But it's still going to regenerate all the pages.
It's going to regenerate the pages, yes, but not regenerate the static content.
Okay. Gotcha.
The JavaScript and CSS and minify it and all of that. So it's for speed. So yeah, it's just the object in general looks like this. Again, here's your destination. Here's a glob, which defines the files that you want to load. This is where you want to export the HTML. Parent is your parent object. I just realized my colon's in the wrong place there. Page config, well, you guys kind of get it with the one before, but I'm going to continue. So the only other one is glob object, and so you can expand glob, and it takes a pattern which to match files with to be processed, a ignore pattern which can take an array for files that you don't want to match, and a current working directory, which is kind of the root of where pattern should be applied to and ignore should be applied to. By default, this is always kind of the current folder that DocumentJS.json is in. So the next part, and this is kind of where it gets crazier, is how to document your actual application. And there's a lot to consider, right? There's what type of application do you have? Do you have kind of a multi-module library or app? Something like CanJS or samsclub.com? Or do you have something like jQuery or underscore, which is a single module, it's just a single export. You're exporting the $, you're exporting underscore. You don't want things kind of broken up by modules, just more there's something with a bunch of methods on it. In some ways, CanJS is currently this, but it's evolving to this. Then once you've decided on what kind of project you want to document, there's how to structure it, right? So that you have your kind of main page that everything is under, and then you can have subfolders underneath that, substructures, right? How you actually make parent-child relationships so this sidebar is easily navigatable. So you kind of have to feel that out depending on the project, but then once you have that, then there's the actual entities that you're documenting. And depending on what type of entity, you use kind of one of these tags here, which I'm going to go into. Now these entities, you use the Google Closure annotations to document, so we're going to have to talk about that, how you actually like specify values and default values and types and things like that. And then there's the whole other tags that you can use to decorate essentially the type of objects up above, right? If I want to say that something inherits from something else, there's tags for that. So there's a lot to know about documenting that I'm going to break down now. So the only thing I'm not going to talk about how to document a single module project, because I think the vast majority of what we do is now multi-module. So I created an example of a multi-project that has a folder structure like this. It's got a main, it's got a readme.markdown, it's got you know, some documentation on how to install the application. It's got a graph library and then these two utility files. And I want it to show up something like this. I want to list my modules, and I want to have some guides for behavior. So let's talk about how to set something like this up. First thing is in my README, I'm going to create, this is essentially the home page. I'm going to say, instead of giving like an index or something like this, I always give the name of the actual project. Sometimes because you'll have projects within other projects. This was a need for like JavaScript and VC, which you know we can actually document all of JavaScript and VC to contain CanJS, but we could also document CanJS by itself. That's why you don't give index, always give the name. And I can define what kind of groupings I want available underneath the multi-page. These are things that can be parents of other kind of documented objects. That's, to go back, that's why modules and guides show up here, because I want a modules and guides kind of subsection for the stuff underneath multi. And then it provides documentation. So the next thing, I'm going to start documenting the graph, add, and date helpers. And there's a question, kind of how you document those depends on what essentially they're exporting. Is it a single function that it's being exported? Is it an object with properties that's being exported? Like, you know, date helpers might be that. Or is it a single constructor function? The graph is essentially a module that exports a single constructor function. So depending on what your module does, you document a little bit differently. So let's take a module that exports a single function. So I might have that add module, multi-util add. So I'm going to say, hey, this is a module, and I'm going to give the definition of what it exports, and I'm going to give the module's name. I'm going to give its parent what I want it to show up under. I want it to show up under that group, multi-modules, and then I'll essentially provide the you know, a signature for it and the parameters and what it returns. And describe that. So if something's like exporting a single function, you know, you might document it like this. Now, if something is exporting a bunch of exports, so here I'm exporting a tomorrow and a yesterday, I might say that, hey, this is actually exporting a module. I could also put an object in here. I'm going to give the name of my module, and again, I want this to show up under multi-modules. I'm going to give a description, and it's going to create sub-pages for, and I'm going to document the tomorrow and yesterday. This will actually create sub-pages for tomorrow and yesterday that are underneath multi-util date helpers. And the cool thing about DocumentJS is it will, what I think is cool, is it'll actually infer the parent-child relationship of these so they show up underneath automatically. You don't have to provide them a parent because modules can be parents of other things if it's not in the same file.
Very quick question, is that double slash after the first block necessary?
It is now because there's a bug. So if
Okay, but there's potential to fix it? Or?
Yeah. A better regular expression would fix it.
Because I think we ran into something similar before, and it's kind of weird because does it error if you don't, or does it just choke and not show the
The
second?
regular expression, we need a better regular expression, essentially.
Would it help to use a Screamer or something?
I've created a branch that does use a schema, but the hard part is a schema. It's very difficult to figure out what a comment relates to what code with a schema. Because it's not nearly as easy as just like saying, hey, what's the next line look like?
Yeah, because it parses, it adds code comment blocks separately.
Yeah.
Right?
So it's much more difficult to pull out comments with a schema. I've started that, but I've not completed it.
But oh yeah, it does matter because you are showing the code too, right? The first line.
You do use the code. So you don't actually even have to provide this function tomorrow. It would pick up that it is a function named tomorrow. And it would actually call it, what it's actually going to call this function is multi-util date helpers dot tomorrow. And I'm not sure if I show this. I don't think I do. I can show it once I'm done going through all of these. So yeah, this is how you might do something that exports multiple values. The next thing you might want to do is a function. You're going to export like a function that is exporting a constructor function. So here I've got a graph that I'm probably going to use as a constructor function. I'm exporting that. What you'll do is you'll say a module that returns essentially the same thing that is the module, right? We'll learn about Google closure annotations, but this is how you specify what a function returns. So this is saying, hey, I've got a function that returns essentially itself. That is how you can document a constructor function. And after I declare the constructor function, I'm going to have if I want to have some prototype properties, I can say, hey, here's the prototype. I'm starting to define prototype properties, and here I've got a toChart method on the prototype. So what it'll actually do is it'll call this toChart method multi/lib/graph.prototype.toChart. Oh, and there's an alternate way, which actually I think is now more the approved way. I forgot to mention this. This way works, but this is actually probably the I don't know why I highlighted it. Oh, never mind. Okay, this is the. I kind of got my slides messed up here, but you can also do new and say that, hey, when this function is created, it creates a new instance of this. So that's actually probably the better way of doing it. Now, also what I wanted to mention is this graph data. I want to talk about Typedef real quick. This is very commonly used. This graph might take some type of complex graphing data that I want to document. What you can do is you can say, hey, that graph data is of type multi-lib graph data, and we can use a Typedef to define what graph data needs to look like. So I might want that Typedef to be, I might want graph, when you go to the graph page, it to have a type section, and I'm going to eventually want this graph data to show up underneath that. So that's why I'm going to add this type section group, type group, and I might have a Typedef. This should actually be called graphdata.markdown, because these are almost always in markdown files because you know, these structures don't exist. They're like saying, hey, you need to provide me an object that has an array of numbers called data, and an array of strings called columns. So you create a typedef that way. So let me show what this page, what all of this outputs. So I didn't actually document it very much, but it's more about the structure, right? So I have my multi-page, and it's got its modules, graph, and then graph has its own children. It has the prototype chart method, and we have this graph data, right, which is a type. So that group is what created the types kind of section right here, and we said we want graph data to show up underneath that. Any questions there? No? Cool. So let me go on to talk about the different type tags. So we kind of went through a few of them, but these are essentially, these are the most important tag that you can put on things, which define what it is, right? What are you documenting? There's module, which is saying, hey, I'm documenting a module and its export value. There's a typedef, which is how you define a custom type. A page, which is just means like, hey, I want to create an HTML page of information. This isn't necessarily associated with any, physical code entity. A function is a JavaScript function. A property is a property on a value or an object. Typically, when you're defining a function, by the way, and at least in our apps, that's a function on an object. It's really a function as a property 90% of the time. Because if you wanted a function that was an export value, well, that should have been done as a module and not a function. Does that make sense? Hopefully what I've said makes sense. So these are kind of the main things that you'll be using like most of the time. And it's kind of interesting that really there's only these 5 things, and you can pretty much document everything. And all the other ones are mostly about structure. So a group is a placeholder for other types. Like we saw, it kind of creates that types placeholder. So it can house other objects underneath it. Static is a kind of default, is just a type of group. It's just an easy way to create a group named static. These are typically used for static properties on a kind of constructor function, on a function. Just like prototype creates a placeholder for prototype properties on a function. Right? It's just, in some ways, these are here just to create an object that can have children, but it in itself doesn't have any documentation. That's what essentially what a group is. It's something that has children that can belong to something else, but it doesn't have documentation. You can't actually click on it on the sidebar. And then finally, there's add. And add essentially allows you to change the default parent object. So as I mentioned previously, in this example, toChart knows that its parent object is the prototype. You can essentially set a default parent, right? The default parent after a prototype is the prototype, but you can configure and change that at any point with the add type tag. So let's see how these work. They look like a module. You're going to give it a type definition, followed by a name, followed by an optional title. So here's an example of if I had a module that was exporting an object who had a name property that was a string. I could define a module like that, and I could give information about that module. Or I could define a module that exports a function. Now, these things we kind of need to learn about real quick before we get to the other types. This is a type definition. So here, it's everything kind of in these brackets that you can use for on params and options and modules and type defs. They all take these type definitions. And here's kind of, there's 2 pages here of the available type definitions. So a lot of times it's just very simple. It's just, hey, I have a Boolean, and you write a Boolean, or anything else. Any other name you can just write in here. But then there's other types, and you can decorate the type to give them more information about how it's used. So there's the all type, that means it takes anything. There's the unknown type, which means it's kind of like the all type, but this more means like I don't know what what this actually can take or what it can give. It's probably determined by something else that like we don't actually have control over. I don't really use question mark too often. There's a type application, which basically, this is like in other languages like Java, you can kind of parameterize a type. This says I have an array of strings. This says I have an object that is going to have a string property that points to a number. So this is an object where every property value is a number. You can have the dot here or not have the dot here. It doesn't really matter. I tend to not have the dot, but Google Closure shows it having the dot. I tend to write my documentation with not using the dot. There's a type union, which means, hey, this type is either a number or a Boolean, or this argument is a number or Boolean. There's a record type, which says this is an object that has a myNum property that is a number, and a myObject property that has a type not specified. You can say an argument or something is nullable, so you can pass in either a number, it should be capital N, number, or null. This says you can definitely not pass in null. You have to pass in an object. By default, everything's assumed to be non-nullable. But I guess if you want to provide extra emphasis, you could do this. Like you must pass this, even though it might seem like you could get away without it. Variable parameters, this means, hey, if this was on a parameter, you can call an unlimited number of numbers. And optional is kind of like number, but this means nullable. This means you can pass null. This means you don't have to actually pass it. So this is for normal objects, and there's also annotations regarding a function. So if you have a function, you can specify the types of its arguments. So this says, hey, this parameter is actually taking a function that takes a string and a Boolean. The next one is this is a function that returns a number. The next one is this is a function that returns a function that will be called back with, so that this is going to be the menu, some kind of menu type, and its first argument is a string. This is a function that's going to be called with the new operator and is like creating a new menu instance. And then finally, you can also say, hey, this is a function that's going to be called with a string followed by like either nothing or an indeterminate number of numbers. So that's a type expression. There's also name expressions, like are seen with params. So I can say, hey, the param is of type string, and then you can also provide a little bit of additional information in the name expression. So if you just want to give a name of a type or a parameter, you just put a name in. But you can also specify that it's optional by putting brackets around it. And you can also provide a default value by putting equal. Now sometimes you might want an equal inside here or a special, if you want quotes or some special, you want a bracket, you can escape by putting backslash or whatever, /. You can escape like quotes or equal. that would normally break this thing. So that's a name expression. So yeah, modules, you're providing one of those type expressions. The name, this is kind of what page will be created, the actual kind of HTML page will be created, and this is what you want to show up in the sidebar. Typedef is the same kind of thing. It's what type the person should be creating. This is saying, hey, I want to describe something that is an object that always has a name property that is a string. I can do that like this and then describe that name property better. Alternatively, I could say, hey, I want a function, I want to describe some type of handler function, and the handler function will always take a string, and I could create a typedef like this as well. Typedefs are, again, for things that like, hey, an event callback function is a perfect candidate for a typedef because that's something that the user is going to provide, but there's a lot of information on how that function is called, what its arguments will be, that kind of thing. A typedef is perfect for describing a callback function that a user has to provide. The function, this is a function that's typically a property of an object, a function, or the kind of window in general. So here I can define a function that's controls after method, which I just realized doesn't even make sense. Control doesn't have an after method. I think I meant map. But let's say it did have an after method. I can say, here's my function, and I want to give it the parameter. It's going to take a name as the first argument and a value as the second argument, which can be any type, right? It's optional. A property is what you would use to describe a non-function property of an object, function, or window. So here I have a config property that is going to be an object that has a foo, that's a string, a bar, that's a boolean, and then I can go on and describe more information about foo and bar. A page is just a page of documentation, again, not associated with anything. So you just give it a name and a title you want to show up in the sidebar. You can notice that all of these pretty much have a title. All of these high-level, type tags have a title and a name. Some have a little bit of information, but yeah, this is just a page of HTML, essentially markdown. A group is, like I said, is a child. It's going to be make itself a child container of whatever the current type is, but it doesn't have documentation. It's just a placeholder so other things can show up underneath it. So here, if I created a page guides and I wanted an install subsection and a build subsection, I could create those, and then I could have another page for prerequisites that would show up under install. Prototype is just like the same thing, just like a group, but it's a special group that will add itself as the current scope of everything else after it, and also create that that essentially unclickable section in the sidebar. Static does the exact same thing, right? This prototype is just designed to be the static properties on a constructor function. And then add, again, let's say I had a plugin for my graph constructor function that was in a totally different file, and it was adding this plugin method. Well, if I had a bunch of things that this plugin was adding, a bunch of other methods, I might want to just say, hey, I'm adding to graph's prototype, so that all I have to kind of write here is function, and it'll know to pick up plugin and add it to graph.prototype.plugin. So, and then there's a bunch of modifier tags, which we'll go through. All of these simply change the behavior of a type tag or decorate it with more information. So I'll go through these kind of quick. The parent tag specifies the actual parent you want this object to show up underneath, right? Sometimes this can be inferred. It'll typically read whatever the current kind of scope is of the documentation, whatever kind of, if we added to graph.prototype, it will, you know, a normal comment without parent will use that, but we can specify it. So if I want this plugin to be on graph prototype, I can hard code that, and you can also specify what order you want this doc object to be shown in the sidebar. I'm saying I want it to be first. If you don't provide anything, it's just kind of alphabetical. Essentially what happens is, I think it's alphabetical by default, except for things that actually have this number, and then it sorts them independently and puts them in the beginning. A signature is, let's say is basically for anything you want one of those blocks. So I'm going to show what I mean by this. So like this is a signature block right here. Now this signature block is inferred. So if you just have a function, it'll try to create a signature for you just based around what your parameters are and what your title is of your function or your module or whatever. However, you can provide a signature which will replace that, and you can provide as many signatures as you want. You can provide a signature describing, you know, some piece of code, and that can have its own parameters. These parameters belong to this signature and function, and other tags belong to this signature, and you can have multiple of these signatures. This is how, for instance, like CanMapAtter has a lot of weird different signatures. Well, we can break them out, even though it's for one function we're describing. It's pretty nice. So there's signature param. Parameters can be used to describe a signature, or they can be used to describe a function's parameters.
What does that mean exactly? So you could, if they're underneath signature, that means they're describing that particular signature?
Exactly.
You had multiple signatures? Okay.
Yeah, so param is going to describe, essentially, you can almost think of this as its own context. Param is going to describe a signature, but if there isn't a signature, it's going to like describe the function. Typically, you should not have like a function and then a param and then a signature and then a param, because again, once you have a signature, it blows away the default signature that's created. So a param is essentially going to describe an argument for either a signature or a function. Here, I'm describing columns, and I'm saying it's an array of strings. Return is going to describe the return value of a signature, or a function or a signature. In this case, I don't have a signature, it's just returning. It's describing the return value of a function.
Is that lowercase true, the default value?
That's actually, no, that's a mistake. I realized that too.
Well, there would be a default value.
Now, there's no way, unfortunately, to describe the default value of a return, just because the semantics of the default values are always like there's no semantics that allow me to do that. I mean, that's something that we could add, but it's not something that Google Closure or Google Annotations support. Unfortunately, I wish it did. Like it would be nice if we could probably add like Boolean equals false. We could also support that kind of syntax and types as well.
A quick question. Are there any places where we need to watch out or avoid multiple line comments or text for a particular, like return tag? You have on 2 lines.
Yeah.
Are there any issues with that at all, or will it always?
Most things. I mean, it'll be in the documentation, but most things that you expect to like be able to write multiple lines accept multiple lines. There's things like inherits that only take a single line. A lot of the things that you would normally put on top, like version, release, that kind of thing, only take a single line. But most things where you might want to put a full paragraph down, those work multi-line.
Okay.
So that's return this. There's also a this, which is very rarely used, but could be helpful. The @this describes. Oh, I did not change the thing. The @this describes the this value of a function. So this. It's hard. I hate always the word this. It's like so difficult to describe. But @this describes what a function's this value will be. Typically, this is most useful for Typedef. So, hey, this updated function takes another function that I'm doing at Typedef, and graph is making sure that handler is always going to be called with this as an instance of graph. Option is used to define. It's used for two things. One, it's used to define a. So I have a parameter that's taking an array or strings or a string. I can describe individually either type, right? So it can be used to describe kind of a type set. So here's a bunch of types. I can describe individual types within that type set. Also, oh, did I not include it? I must have forgot about it. Also, options can be used to describe option. I'm gonna show this. I forgot to. It's an important one. So also, if I had, there's another kind of form in this where, let's say I had an option on an argument that was like, type was a string, count was a number. I can describe the properties of a object as well. That was a parameter. So this would be string type number count. Right. So this is. So option can also be used to describe record values, object types, and their properties and values. The body tag essentially says that all the content following it is marked down content that will be placed after all signature and API text. So the content that comes after the content that comes down here after all signatures, by the way, this is description because I'm going to describe that next. This is body text. Comes down there. So, yeah, body text. Description text is the stuff that comes before all signature and API text. This is like that first little blurb that quickly describes whatever you're documenting. So I can add a description and then add columns to a graph, and this will actually appear before all signatures. Well, and then I'm going to talk about by default though. The default behavior of text that's kind of found not in a signature, not in a param, not in a return, if you have text that's not found in a multi-line tag, and what I mean by a multi-line tag is like at return is a multi-line tag. So if something's found outside of a multi-line tag, it's first assumed to be a description, and then if there's a line break, like an empty line, after that point it's assumed to be the body. So if I had a function like this, and I just had text after it, this text is going to be the description, and then this text will be part of the body. But if I were to, just to make this clear, if I were to add a signature here, then all of this becomes part of the signature's description, multi-line. The signature is a multi-line tag. Hopefully that makes sense. Next is hide. Hide allows you to either hide this kind of doc object, what you're documenting, from the sidebar, but it still will create an HTML page, just will not show up in the sidebar, or you can hide particular parts of what is normally rendered as part of a documentation page. So if I want to hide this, I want to render this, I want to render something, but I don't want the sidebar to show up, and I don't want the title, and I don't want the footer or the article or the container to show up, I can specify to hide those. This is typically used for kind of pages that maybe maybe you want the home page. For instance, when we generate the home page, I'm hiding everything because I just want essentially an empty page for the content of canjs.com. So you can do that this way, hide those other pieces. Release is used to define when either a parameter, signature, or a doc object altogether was released. So you can have a release on, if you have a release right here, it'll say this function was released on 1.0, and if you have a release right here, it'll say the signature was added in 1.1. Deprecated indicates on a whole lot. You can't really deprecate a signature, which would be nice. You can't do that right now. But you can deprecate a whole doc object, and you give it a version and some text, multi-line text, for information that will be shown. Okay, so that's all the tags and documentation. Now let's talk about how to generate the configured documented code. So just a reminder, if you had a doc config like this, that let's say it has a 1.1 version, a 2.1 version, and it has a pages site. This is what kind of DocumentJS's, the command lines API looks like. If I were to run that executable, this will generate all versions and all sites, meaning it will download 1.1 and 2.1, generate them, and also generate all sites inside here, side pages. Now you can, and it will, by default, debug is off, watch is off, and force build is off. And I'll talk about those means. So if I just run this, it's going to basically generate everything. Now if I'm just shortening it so I don't have to write all of this. If I were to call DocumentJS executable with pages, the name of either a site or a version, it will just document that site or version. That's nice for performance reasons. Hey, if I'm just working on CanJS's API, I don't want to build all of its guides and its homepage. So this would essentially just generate mostly CanJS's homepage. You can also provide it a version number, and you can also provide it a for a version, you can also provide it a path that will overwrite the source of the version. So what this will say is, hey, I want to document only 1.1, but instead of using 1.1's source here to go download it from the web, I'm going to use a local CanJS version and use that. So this is much faster because it's not actually having to download anything. And you can work on it iteratively. And what I want to say is, this is an example where I want to be working on CanJS 1.1 from this repository. I want to watch for any changes. I want to force build, and I want debug output. Because we use yargs, you can kind of combine your optional parameters like this, which is nice.
Yards.
Yargs. So let's talk about customizing a little bit, how you customize the look and feel. So in DocumentJS, there's a site folder that has a default folder within it that has the default static content, so the default JavaScript and CSS, and a templates folder that is the default templates used to render the HTML of the page, of every single page. What you can provide in your .config is an overwrite for either templates and static, and where to what folder should be used as overwrites for the default content. So let's say I had a folder. I'm not going to show actually static, but let's say I wanted to overwrite the default layout template of that DocumentJS comes with. I could say, hey, templates, I want to point to theme templates, and in my theme templates folder, I could put any mustache templates in here that I want. What it will do is it'll kind of combine the default templates with whatever templates that I have in a folder. And what it'll do is it'll go through and convert each of these to compile them with mustache, and it's going to render. Essentially, what it does, it's going to make all of them available as anything you put in here in your templates will be available as a partial. But by default, what it's going to do is render the content template and then get the source of that and stick that in the rendered output of a layout of the layout template. So, but you will typically override your content or layout to call out to any other partials you want, or you can adjust these if you want on their own. So just for instance, to give an example of this, DocumentJS itself DocumentJS has a override for layout, and essentially all I did was copy the default layout, and I just made changes in it. The changes all I made were to add the menuing system to make sure people can link to CanJS and jQuery++, and to give links to the API and to Twitter and GitHub. So that's how you can kind of control the behavior. The other cool thing that I didn't actually reference in the talk or in the present PowerPoint presentation is if you want helpers, you want mustache helpers, all you have to do is create a JavaScript file. Any JavaScript file in here will be imported, and all it needs to do is export a function that returns a bunch of an object with helpers, like a link to something, and this would be a mustache helper. There's actually a pretty powerful customization engine in it now that you can, relatively easy provide your own helpers. This gets, by the way, this gets called with the doc, all the configuration options from DocumentJS, and it gets also called with the doc map, which is an object that has all of the documented objects in it, and it also gets called with a get current, which is a method that can give you the current object being documented. And then these are all your helpers that you want available in your templates. I think it's pretty cool that you can create helpers so easily. Eventually, this is just going to replace Jekyll. So you can do the same thing with static. You can overwrite static. I'm not going to really go into that in depth, but just so you guys know, there's really only one file that's important for static. What is going to happen is after the kind of combination of whatever overrides you added, override the default static, it's just going to simply look for this build.js, and it's going to build.js. It's gonna import that and call. This is expected to export a method. It's going to call that method, and it is expected to build the final output, the final built output that should be used on the site for CSS and JavaScript. In this case, it's actually a Steel application. This will actually call Steel tools, and it's going to, the endpoint that it's going to build, kind of the main module that it's going to build is this static.js. So if you guys start overwriting stuff, really what you do is in your static, you'll overwrite this static.js and make sure it imports any additional modules that you want. All right, so again, just because we're going a little bit in depth for you guys, here's canjs.com. Its static theme has I overwrote its static that basically looks the exact same as the default static. It just steals app.js, and app.js is what really imports all of the additional controls and models and stuff needed for canjs.com. And you have your overwritten styles as well, which essentially canjs.com essentially overwrites all the styles, all the default styles. Eventually, I'm hoping that that won't be the case. So, yeah, static, and then finally, contributing. Essentially, here's how DocumentJS works. It reads the configuration, documentjs.json, and will download the versions and any versions necessary. And it'll use the configuration then to find the files to be processed, and actually it'll find the files and get their text, their actual content. And then it'll pass it off to this process thing that, given all the tags, reads through line by line and essentially converts these files into what's called a doc object. And a doc object is just like a bunch of properties that will be passed to, it's an object of properties that's passed to a template that the template uses to render out the final output of the page. So once all of the doc objects are processed, it passes them to that default HTML generator, and the generator builds the templates and static content and uses the templates to write out each doc object. So a doc object essentially looks like this. This is what we're building to. All those tags are, all they're doing is adding properties to an object like this. So a name might have a parent, might have a description, some type information, and a body. And all we're doing is saying, hey, templates, render this with your helpers and things like that. And that's all they do. So the source of DocumentJS is kind of organized along those lines. There's a command folder that's just used for the command line helpers. There's a configure that reads documentjs.js or .json and kind of adds the default values and knows how to go and download the new versions and things like that. Everything that's kind of directly related to the configuration object happens in this configured folder. The find folder is used to go get, given kind of a final configuration, go get these and everything downloaded in its place, go get the files to process. Really all this returns is an event object that has an event triggered whenever a file is found. Process consumes that event object and will read the file and run it through all of the tags and get that final doc object out. It gets all of these doc objects using the tags. And then finally, there's this generate, and which really doesn't do much in the HTML, default HTML generator, that given all of the doc objects and kind of the configured options, writes out the final resulting page. The cool thing about it is you can actually have other generators pretty easily now that are like written as plugins. So you could say, hey, I want to export this to like something like Lodash's documentation, which is all single page. You could have other HTML generators or things that just generate, who knows what based upon reading this content in the tag.
I want a man page generator. That'd be amazing.
Yeah, you could probably do a lot of that kind of stuff. So that's it. The big thing, hopefully everybody's kind of learning to pay attention to this, and thank you for bearing with me on my first time I've ever actually tried to teach people DocumentJS. The cool thing about it now, in my opinion, is just how stupidly powerful it is. I mean, it really can be used to, oh, come on back. I mean, it can just be used to build any kind of site now, any static site. And it's really extendable. Like, I didn't go into how you can create your own tags, but that's pretty easy. How you can create your own generators, and even how extendable the default HTML generator is. There's a lot of work to be done, I think, to, in terms of its own documentation and in terms of making it simple and easy to use. But I'd love to hear what you guys have to say and think about where this project can go from this point forward.
Service, DocumentJS, GitHub pages. That's all I'm going to say. Post it online, and
Yeah, I agree.
yeah, just as soon as you push, your page is being regenerated for you, and you have your latest documentation online.
Yeah, that kind of thing is very doable. And the other thing is, although I didn't document the actual, the funny thing about DocumentJS's documentation right now is that its internals are documented very well. Because I'm trying this theory out that if I document the internals very well, that people at Bitovi will be more likely to contribute, or other people will be more likely to contribute to this project and make it better if I really focus on the internal documentation. I don't know if that's true, but almost any method that you find, especially anything substantial, you can pretty much expect to have something documenting how it works. So if I just go to fine, right? Pretty much everything has pretty decent documentation now.
It'd be great if there was a way to toggle public versus private APIs. That'd be really nice in CanJS.
So what I just did is I just put internal APIs down here. That's the pattern that I'm taking for documenting DocumentJS. Is I want to have DocumentJS is a very difficult thing for me. It's been difficult for me to figure out how to document. Oh, one thing, the customizing docs are actually off the chain. I think I did a really good job with that. But itself, because there's so many different types of projects, I think a lot of it is I'm just going to create a bunch of examples for the documenting section, which I did create. Right, this example right here. And I think a few examples like that will go a long way, and maybe with a video kind of walking through how those are done. But that's kind of my plan right here, is just we'll have our guides, we'll have the high-level configuration guides about that doc object, or not the doc object, the doc config, what's available on this, the tags themselves, the command line APIs, the grunt API, and how to set up grunt. And then everything else is just going to be, you can see it pretty much lines up with the folders, right? So like configured, here's how, it has a generate method and what it does and how it works and its options. It's extremely well documented for any internal code, DocumentJS. So we'll see how that pays off.
I have a question. I'm not sure if you hit on this or not, but what about like the pattern of should we use like a submodule? I guess it probably depends on the project, but is it better to use like a submodule or have your documentation branch in one folder and then like in a sibling folder have the branch that you're working on?
Sibling folder, because especially with versioned, it's better to do sibling now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The only drawback for sibling is that demos might not work great because you're not actually doing the copy. I haven't figured out how to siblings work or working on a demo work spectacular yet. I'm thinking that we might even just make it so that it assumes your sibling is also locally hosted and can just rewrite the path to where that iframe or whatever should be. I think that shouldn't be too hard to make work. But yeah, definitely the pattern is now, when I'm working on, the pattern is for you guys really, if you're working on canjs.com, make sure you have canjs next to it. And in canjs.com, well, we're using grunt, so you can do grunt DocumentJS. Well, you probably don't want to use grunt actually to do it. You could just use the normal DocumentJS. So you would do node modules, then DocumentJS, and then you would say, if you're doing 2.1, and you would do @canjs. And that would treat the sibling CanJS folder as if it was the 2.1 version. Okay. Yeah. Any other questions? What do you think it takes to get people excited about documentation? What do you guys think we would have to do to make this like the go-to project?
Yeah.
Providing an online service for if you're lazy.
I think the trouble with getting people excited about documentation is like getting into the nitty-gritty details of like function signatures and stuff like that. I don't have an answer, but that's the things people that you see other projects not doing. And it's frustrating, but I don't know how to change their mind.
One other thing I thought about was, I have to get going in 3 minutes. This went a lot longer than I thought. One other thing I thought about was, documentation and tests are almost sometimes the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
It would be nice if there was a way to like unify that.
Mm.
Like to say that, like just assume this was CanJS or something like that. To say, it'd be nice to say, for an example, like, like here's an example of using the full name example. I'm just thinking it would be nice to do a I don't know if this is maybe outside the realm of.
This is a real thing. There's a name for this, where like you write your code in the documentation. It's like document first. I don't remember the name.
Yeah, probably. But anyways, I mean, you get what I'm saying. And then like I could have like a cert The whatever that it should be. I mean, you get what I'm saying, right? This to me would be a very compelling thing, I think, for us in our projects, where you could, maybe you specify it as test, and we have something that will, some process of DocumentJS can literally run through all of these things and build tests, like just essentially extract this out into a test case somehow. And then it also is documented. I don't know if that can work, but we've written examples in the past that don't work. And if you're starting a project, especially, I really love this kind of like, hey, you can, a little bit of explanation. Use a compute to whatever, and all the behavior is documented this way. And you kind of make people look at the text, and you write tests that are understandable because you're expecting them to be documented. I don't know. It's one thing I do like about Angular's website is that everything includes a text. Like all of their examples, like are tested. They're doing assertions and things like that. And I wonder if there's some magical way to unify all of that. Anyways, thanks for joining me, everybody. I've got a 1:30 meeting, and let me know. So start using DocumentJS in your projects.
Thanks.
Cool. Thanks, bye.